So we've moved on from analysis to evaluation, and one part about evaluating informational text is looking at the logic or reasoning behind an informational text information or arguments. So the first thing we need to look at with logic is deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. So these are two different types of reasoning that an argument or information can have. Deductive reasoning is general to specific, and inductive reasoning is specific to general. Let me show you a graphic organizer to help you with that. So basically, inductive reasoning starts out with individual observations or experiments. This is kind of like CSI. So individual clues lead to an overall theory for what happened in CSI. So what you'll see with an article that uses inductive reasoning is that they will set up lots of individual items or reasons that support an overall theory. Specific observations lead to an overall conclusion. Deductive reasoning is the opposite. Deductive is general to specific, meaning that it starts with an overall theory that is held to be true, and that overall theory is applied to a specific thing. For instance, an overall theory that we can pretty much be sure is true is like gravity. So you know that when you toss something off a building, that it is going to fall to the ground because of gravity. So if you say, I know this marker will hit the ground because I know the theory of gravity, you are using deductive reasoning to support your idea that the marker is going to hit the ground. You're starting with this overall theory and applying it to a specific instance. Now, what can be a problem with inductive and deductive reasoning is when you have a false premise. So a false premise is going to be whatever step you start at, whether inductive reasoning, if you start with observations, small observations, or deductive, when you start with a theory, whatever your starting point is, it is false or incorrect. So you can think of false premise like that, false or incorrect, premise being starting point. So for inductive reasoning, a false premise might be like in CSI when they have several clues. One of the clues maybe is a plant. Someone put it there by mistake or put it there on purpose to frame somebody. So if you have a clue that's incorrect, they might use good inductive reasoning and come up with a theory, but because their clue was incorrect, they have an incorrect conclusion. It's the same for deductive reasoning. If you start with an incorrect theory and apply it to a specific situation, then you can come up with an incorrect outcome. So let's say you had a false premise for a theory that all teachers were female, and then you decided to use that on your male teacher and call him Mrs. So you would have a bad conclusion because you had a false premise. Your theory was incorrect. One more term we need to learn is rebuttal. Now rebuttal can be unconnected to this reasoning or connected. So basically a rebuttal is just a counter argument. So whether you use inductive or deductive reasoning to reason an argument, a rebuttal is just a statement that refutes that argument. So just kind of a random term there you also need to know. So moving on to logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are flaws in reasoning. So instead of having a false premise with correct reasoning, so you have good reasoning, you use reasoning the correct way, but still end up with a false conclusion with a false premise. Logical fallacies, you may have correct things, but you have a flaw in your line of reasoning. So here are a few examples of ways people can have flawed reasoning. First is appeal to fear. So this is when someone incites fear rather than using a valid argument. Here's an example. We have this kid. For him, there's nothing worse than waking up cold, wet, and alone, except waking up cold, wet, and surrounded by friends. So you see this is an ad for Good Nights, and this is basically trying to scare parents and kids into getting this product, instead of giving good, valid reasons for buying this product. Next, we have false analogy. This is making a false comparison or taking a comparison too far. So an analogy is a good way to reason things out, but if you compare things that really aren't similar, or you take your comparison too far and say things are similar in ways that they're not, it can turn into a false analogy. So here's an example. So we have our current president and our former president both being compared to Hitler. These are both very different presidents, but you can see they were both compared to Hitler. Obviously, these can't both be true, and really neither one of them are true. So making comparisons to Hitler is kind of also a use of appeal to fear, because they're trying to make a comparison to scare you into believing something about a president that is not really a use of logic. Instead of arguing against each of these president's beliefs, this person is just comparing them using a false analogy. Moving on from there. Next we have ad hominem. This is a very common one. Attacking an opponent's character in an attempt to undermine their arguments. This again is similar to our last one. So, debate strategy, win arguments with ad hominem attacks. Your face is a logical fallacy. So you see that this is an example of someone attacking a person rather than their arguments. So the Hitler comparison is another thing. So saying someone is a dictator instead of arguing against their points would be an example of an ad hominem attack. It distracts people from the real debate on the issues and has them focus on a person's character. Moving on from there, we have slippery slope. This is kind of a difficult one. Slippery slope is the idea that if A happens, if a certain event happens, then B, C, all the way till Z will happen. So this is the idea that you start with one thing and then something else, all the way to the worst possible conclusion. So the problem with this is that it avoids the specific issue you're talking about and focuses on extreme hypothetical situations without really backing it up. So it's a slippery slope because you start with one thing and it slides all the way to the end. So this one can be tricky because sometimes there's logical steps between A, B, C, but the problem is that you start with one thing and you make this unsubstantiated claim that you are going all the way to this disastrous conclusion. So watch out for those arguments. Next is non-sequitur. This one's kind of my favorite because it's kind of random. Non-sequitur means it does not follow in Latin. And basically this means that there is no logical connection between ideas. Someone will say a statement and then make another statement that has no connection. This reminds me of All That, where you have this character by Kale who just says Jupiter all the time. So you ask him, why is the sky blue? He says Jupiter. Or what's 2 + 2? He says Jupiter. So basically this one has no logical connection to the previous statement. It does not follow. And finally, false authority. This is using poor, suspicious, or unrelated authority to back up a claim. So this is when you use bad sources. For instance, like that time I told you about the student who did a paper on Martin Luther King, but used the KKK as an authority. So this can be a biased source, or it can be kind of more of a trick. You can use a good source. For instance, let's say there is a math professor at UT, which would be a very trusted source, but you are asking her for information regarding an English paper or some sort of literature. While that might be a very trusted source in her own field, she would not necessarily be a trusted source in the field of literature. So this happens a lot with celebrities. Celebrities might be asked their opinion on politics or on politicians, and while they may be great actresses or actors, they are not excellent politicians. So that would be a false authority. So all of these logical fallacies are ways that we mess up in our logic. So we need to be able to pick these out of our articles that we read, as well as avoid them in our own arguments.